At 11:47 a.m. one bomber lifted off carrying more guns than any before it in a fatal flaw. Built to protect the fleet, the YB-40 would soon learn the sky doesn't forgive heavy dreams. 1. At RAF Alconbury, the morning air still smelled of oil and damp grass when Captain James Hartwell climbed toward his aircraft. He was 26 years old, already hardened by 42 combat missions. Yet today, his hands hesitated on the ladder. This wasn't a normal B-17. Ground crews fed belts of .50 caliber ammunition into gun positions that didn't exist 3 months earlier. No bombs, just steel armor and guns, 16 of them. Hartwell had flown through flak, outrun fighters, watched friends vanish in fireballs. But he had never flown something this heavy, this unproven. The YB-40 weighed 4,000 pounds more than any flying fortress he knew. Engineers said it would protect the formation. Pilots whispered it felt wrong. As Hartwell settled into the cockpit, he understood one thing clearly today. The experiment would be tested not in a hangar, but by German fighters waiting in the sky. 2. Hartwell didn't need a briefing to know why this aircraft existed. Every man in the 8th Air Force knew the numbers by heart. In just 3 months, 173 B-17s had failed to come home, not shot down over targets, but slaughtered on the way back. Once the bombs were gone, the formation's thin speeds changed and the sky turned hostile. There were no fighters waiting to save them. American escorts simply didn't have the range. Over Germany, the bombers were alone. The Luftwaffe had learned this lesson well. Focke-Wulf 190s came screaming down from 12 o'clock high out of the sun, where nose guns couldn't track fast enough. Messerschmitt 109s dove through the formations, cannons flashing, hunting the slow, the damaged, the unlucky. Crews called it the gauntlet, a deadly corridor every bomber had to run just to get home. Half the men never reached 25 missions. Inside briefing rooms, commanders searched for answers that didn't exist yet. More armor made bombers slower. Tighter formations meant heavier losses to flak, and fighters just couldn't stay with them. So someone asked a desperate question. What if the bomber didn't need an escort? What if it was the escort? Engineers stripped a flying fortress of everything that didn't fire a gun. Bombs were removed, turrets multiplied, ammunition piled in by the ton, armor plates wrapped the crew in steel. On paper, it was unstoppable, a flying wall of fire that no fighter could penetrate. But paper didn't account for gravity, or drag, or fuel burning faster than hope. As Hartwell ran through his checklist engines rumbling alive beneath him, he wasn't thinking about strategy or statistics. He was thinking about the men who wouldn't make it home if this idea failed. Because today, the YB-40 wasn't just another aircraft. It was the last answer they had left. 3. They called it the YB-40. But among the crews, it earned a different name, the Flying Destroyer. What sat on the runway at Alconbury barely resembled a bomber anymore. The bomb bay was empty, but the nose bristled with guns. The bombardier station had been transformed into a twin .50 caliber chin turret staring straight ahead like clenched teeth. Another dorsal turret rose behind the radio room. Single waist guns were ripped out and replaced with twin mounts. Even the forward fuselage sprouted extra cheek guns. By the time the work was finished, 16 heavy machine guns covered nearly every angle of attack. Ammunition was everywhere. More than 11,000 rounds, metal links, stacked behind bulkheads, beneath floors, beside crew positions. Armor plating wrapped the men inside like a steel cocoon. On paper, no German fighter could survive a close approach. Every vector was covered. Every pass would be met by overlapping fire. Douglas Aircraft converted 12 of them in Tulsa. No mass production, no second chances. This was an experiment, one that would be proven or buried in combat. Colonel Reed chose 7 crews for the first test. Hartwell drew aircraft 42-5738. His crew nicknamed her Hedgehog. It fit. From a distance, she looked dangerous. Up close, she looked heavy. Too heavy. A standard B-17 could claw its way to 20,000 feet in 25 minutes. The YB-40 needed nearly double that. The control yoke felt sluggish, unresponsive, like steering a truck through the sky. Test pilots warned the center of gravity was wrong, pulled backward by all that ammunition. But when Hartwell watched the chin turret traverse smoothly across the horizon, when he imagined fighters breaking apart under converging fire, the doubts faded just a little. At 1:25 p.m., 4 Wright Cyclones roared to life. 168 bombers followed Hedgehog down the runway. The mission was simple: fly where fighters love to hunt. Stay with the formation, protect it at any cost. The theory was bold. The aircraft looked unstoppable. What no one knew yet was how fast that theory would fall behind. 4. The formation reached the French coast at 3:30 p.m. From Hartwell's cockpit, the channel slid away beneath broken clouds as flak bursts began to stain the sky ahead. Black puffs climbed toward the bombers over Guernsey, harmless at first, then closer. Radios crackled. German fighters were scrambling from fields near Rennes. Hedgehog was already burning fuel faster than planned. The climb had cost them more than anyone wanted to admit. At 4:02 p.m., Saint-Nazaire appeared through the haze. The submarine pens sat like concrete scars along the coast. Bomb bay doors opened across the formation. In seconds, the payloads were gone. The B-17s grew lighter faster. They banked for home. That's when the experiment began to fail. Hartwell pushed the throttles forward as the bomber stream surged ahead. The airspeed needle lagged behind. 160, 155. The YB-40 strained at maximum continuous power and could barely hold 148. The distance opened fast. 3 miles. 4. Flight engineer Paul Morrison climbed down from the top turret, eyes locked on the gauges. Cylinder head temperatures were creeping into the red, especially number 3. The extra weight and drag were forcing the engines to work beyond their limits. Morrison throttled it back before it cooked itself to death. Hedgehog slowed again. By now, the main formation was nearly 6 miles ahead. Hartwell could see the other YB-40s scattered behind their assigned groups, all of them bleeding speed, all of them exposed. Then the call came from the waist. Contrails, 4 o'clock high. Focke-Wulf, 1906, maybe 8, climbing hard. Not charging in. Watching, waiting. They weren't aiming for the formation. They were hunting what had fallen behind. Hartwell snapped orders across the intercom. Gunners swung their turrets into position. The chin turret tracked smoothly. The ball turret rotated without a hitch. Twin waist guns slid into firing arcs. 16 guns came alive, covering the sky in overlapping cones of fire. The first fighter dove from 5 o'clock. The tail gunner opened up at 800 yards. Tracers reached out. The German pilot broke hard and climbed away without firing. Another attack came from 11 o'clock high. 2 fighters in trail. The chin turret fired a 4-second burst. Rounds stitched across the lead aircraft's engine cowling. Black smoke erupted. The fighter rolled inverted and vanished toward the channel. For 6 minutes, the flying destroyer worked exactly as promised, but the speed kept bleeding away. The wall of guns could stop an attack, but it couldn't close the distance. And in the empty sky behind the formation, that truth was becoming deadly clear. 5. The German pilots didn't rush in anymore. They didn't have to. Hartwell watched the bomber stream shrink into the distance, the silver shapes blurring into the afternoon haze. 7 miles ahead now, then more. Hedgehog was alone, fat, loud, and struggling to breathe at altitude. The YB-40 was never meant to run. And now, the Luftwaffe knew it. Fuel numbers came in next. They were bad. Morrison didn't sugarcoat it. The climb, the combat power settings, the constant drag from turrets and armor had burned hundreds of gallons more than briefed. At this rate, they had 90 minutes to reach Alconbury. The main formation would be on the ground in 70. Hartwell felt the trap closing. 2 Focke-Wulfs appeared at 2 o'clock holding distance. Not attacking, just circling, waiting for the moment when speed, altitude, and fuel finally aligned in their favor. The YB-40 had become exactly what German doctrine loved most, a straggler. Hartwell shoved the throttles forward again. Number 3. Engine temperature surged back into the red. Morrison stared at the gauge jaw tight, then looked away. They both knew what backing off meant, and they both knew what pushing harder would cost. At 4:43 p.m., the trap snapped shut. 3 fighters came in at once. High right, low left, dead ahead. Hartwell couldn't evade. The flying destroyer turned like a freight train. He held course and prayed the guns would do what the engines could not. The aircraft erupted in fire. Chin turret, top turret, ball turret, waist guns firing through both windows. 8 guns hammered at once. Spent brass cascaded across the fuselage floor. The bomber shook violently under the recoil. The frontal attacker took it first. His canopy shattered. Smoke poured out as the fighter rolled away and fell out of the fight. The high attacker broke early. The low fighter didn't. 20mm cannon shells tore into Hedgehog's right wing. A hydraulic line ruptured. Fluid sprayed across the waist window. The call came fast and sharp, right landing gear system gone. If they made it home, it would be by hand, crank, and luck. Fuel check again. Worse. The formation was 8 miles ahead and still pulling away. Then another voice cut through the radio comm, strained, unmistakable. Captain Richard Hayes. Another YB-40. Another gunship that couldn't keep up. 2 flying destroyers. Both damaged. Both slow. Both burning fuel like time itself. Hayes had an idea. Form up together. 32 guns were better than 16. Hartwell agreed immediately. As the 2 gunships edged closer, the German fighters widened their circles. They didn't attack. They didn't leave. They waited. Because now the hunters knew exactly what the flying destroyer really was. Not an escort, a prize. 6. The 2 YB-40s slid into a loose formation close enough to share fire far enough to avoid collision if one suddenly lost control. 32 guns now covered the sky between them. For a moment, it felt like safety. It wasn't. The German fighters widened their orbit, patient and disciplined. 4 visible, maybe 6. They had learned the rules. The gunships were slow. They burned fuel fast, and sooner or later gravity would force them down. At 5:07 p.m., Hartwell crossed the French coast outbound. The channel opened beneath them, gray, empty, unforgiving. 53 miles to England, 41 minutes at their current ground speed. Morrison ran the numbers again and didn't like what he saw. Number 3 engine was still running hot. They couldn't hold altitude much longer. Hedgehog began to sink. 19,000 feet, 18.8, 18.6. Then Hayes came back on the radio. His number 2 engine oil pressure was dropping fast. If it seized the prop, would tear itself apart. He throttled back to save it. His YB-40 slowed to 138. Both aircraft were bleeding energy now. Both crews watched fuel needles creep toward the empty, and both waited for the fighters to decide whether to follow them over water. At 5:22 p.m., the answer arrived. 2 Messerschmitt 109s appeared at 6 o'clock high, closing fast. The tail gunners called it out, range 400 yards and dropping. The fighters dove through 18,000 feet, cannons flashing at 800 yards. Hartwell couldn't climb. He couldn't accelerate. He couldn't turn hard enough to spoil their aim. The sky around them was empty. No formation, no cover. Just blue space and incoming fire. Tail gunner Raymond Cack fired first. Tracers reached out, but the fighters jinked effortlessly, closing to 400 yards. Cannon shells ripped into Hedgehog's tail. One detonated in the horizontal stabilizer. Another punched through the fuselage 2 feet behind Cack's position. The aircraft shuddered. The controls went soft. Morrison scrambled aft to assess the damage. Elevator cables were intact, but the trim tab mechanism was jammed solid. Hartwell would have to fight the yoke all the way home. As the Messerschmitts climbed for another pass, Hayes's YB-40 opened up with every dorsal gun it had. Tracers filled the sky. The German pilots broke off and climbed away. For the moment, the sky fell silent. But the numbers hadn't changed. Fuel was still disappearing. Engines were still overheating. And England was still a long way off. 7. Time stretched painfully after the Messerschmitts broke away. Not relief, suspense. Hartwell kept both hands locked on the yoke muscles, burning as he fought the jammed trim. Every small correction felt wrong. The YB-40 wanted to drop its nose, sink lower, give gravity what it demanded. Morrison stayed near the tail, reporting damage, watching for smoke, listening for sounds no aircraft should ever make. Behind them, the German fighters climbed again. They didn't disappear, they repositioned. The radio crackled with scattered calls, other bombers, other crews, but none were close enough to help. The main formation was long gone. England was still a promise. On the horizon, over occupied France, Hedgehog was alone in hostile air, wounded and slow. Hayes stayed tucked in, close his 3-engine YB-40, straining to hold position. The 2 gunships flew like exhausted boxers, leaning on each other just to stay upright. 32 guns pointed outward, daring the Luftwaffe to try again. The fighters tested them once more. A feint, a shallow dive. Tracers from the dorsal guns reached out and pushed them back. The Germans had learned the limits. They could attack, but only if patience ran out first. Fuel numbers ticked lower. Altitude slipped foot by foot. 17,000. 16.5. Every 1,000 feet lost meant less time, fewer options. Hartwell knew one hard hit now would end everything. No formation to hide in. No speed to escape with. Just empty sky and cold water ahead. Then far off to the northeast, shapes appeared. Fast, bulky, closing hard. For a second no one spoke. Then the call came, sharp, disbelieving. Fighters, friendly, high speed. Hartwell squinted through the canopy as the silhouettes grew larger. Broad wings, radial engines, sunlight flashing off aluminum. Thunderbolts. The German fighters saw them at the same moment. They didn't wait. They rolled away, noses east, climbing back toward France. No final attack, no bravado, just survival. 4 P-47s thundered past, sliding into escort position wings, rocking in acknowledgement. Hartwell finally let himself breathe. They weren't safe yet, but they were no longer alone. And as the escort settled in, one truth became impossible to ignore. The flying destroyer had survived the fight, but it had proven something far more dangerous. It could shoot. It just couldn't endure. The sky had judged the experiment, and it wasn't finished speaking. 8. At 5:31 p.m., salvation arrived from the northeast. 4 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts dropped out of the sun, big, fast, and angry. Long-range escorts returning from a sweep over Belgium, drawn in by frantic radio calls about stragglers under attack. The German pilots saw them instantly. Messerschmitts rolled away, noses turning east, disappearing back toward France. The Thunderbolts didn't chase. They formed up alongside the 2 wounded gunships and rocked their wings. Escort to the coast. Hartwell exhaled for the first time in nearly an hour. But relief didn't fix the math. Morrison checked the gauges again. Fuel remaining 37 minutes at current power. Distance to landfall, 29 miles. They would make it, but barely. And only if nothing else went wrong. That's when Hartwell finally understood what the mission had proven. The YB-40 worked exactly as a gun platform. No fighter wanted to fly through 16.50 caliber guns. Head-on attacks died fast. Side approaches broke early. In pure firepower, the flying destroyer was unmatched. But war wasn't fought on paper. Once the bombs were gone, the standard B-17s climbed higher and flew faster. The YB-40 couldn't. It still carried 11,000 rounds of ammunition, 4,000 extra pounds that couldn't be dropped. Weight that dragged it down. Weight that turned it into a target. The escort bomber needed an escort. At 5:47, Hayes came back on the radio, voice tight. His number 2 engine was gone. Oil pressure, 0. He feathered the prop and began a slow descent on 3 engines. Morrison did the calculations silently. Hayes wouldn't reach Alconbury, maybe not even home soil. The English coast appeared at 5:53. Hayes aimed for the first strip he could find, RAF Manston. Emergency landing, cleared straight in. Hartwell watched the other YB-40 peel away, limping toward the field, one more experiment, barely holding together. At 6:18 p.m., Hedgehog touched down at Alconbury. Hartwell cranked the landing gear down by hand. The right main locked with seconds to spare. Ground crews counted the damage. Bullet holes, ruptured hydraulics. A jammed trim tab, a wounded tail. Colonel Reed was waiting. Hartwell climbed out soaked in sweat, arms trembling from fighting the controls for 90 minutes. Reed asked one question: how did it perform? Hartwell didn't hesitate. It can't keep up. In that moment, the flying destroyer's fate was sealed. 9. Colonel Reed didn't cancel the program that night. Not yet. War didn't leave room for pride, but it demanded proof. One mission could be bad luck. One crew could be an anomaly. Reed ordered more tests, different tactics, different positions, different hopes. The flying destroyer deserved every chance to justify its existence. It never did. On June 15th, 4 YB-40s lifted off toward Le Mans. After the bomb drop, every one of them fell behind. On June 22, 11 more launched toward the synthetic rubber plant at Huls. One was lost to flak and fighters. The rest limped home hours after the main formation had already landed. Engineers tried everything. Ammunition feeds were rearranged. Weight was shifted forward to fix the center of gravity. Procedures were rewritten. Nothing changed the truth written into the airframe itself. A standard B-17 took off at 65,000 pounds. After releasing its bombs, it shed nearly 17,000. The YB-40 took off heavier and stayed heavy. 4,000 pounds of guns and ammunition that could never be dropped. Every mission ended the same way: slower, lower, alone. Statistics piled up fast and merciless. 48 combat sorties, 5 confirmed fighter kills, 1 YB-40 lost, and one constant across every report: every single gunship fell behind its formation after the bomb drop. Average separation, 7 miles. Average time alone over enemy territory, 38 minutes. The Luftwaffe noticed. German intelligence officers noted the extra turrets, the missing bomb bay doors, the heavy silhouettes lagging at the rear. Their conclusion was brutal and simple. The YB-40 wasn't something to fear. It was something to hunt. On July 29th, the last 2 flying destroyers flew their final combat mission. Both fell behind. Both required fighter escort just to reach England. Both landed short of home base. In August, General Karl Spaatz ended the program. 3 months, 12 aircraft, $5.6 million. The flying destroyer had failed at the one job it was built to do, but buried inside that failure was a lesson the war would never forget. 10. The YB-40 died quietly. No ceremony, no headlines. Just paperwork orders and aircraft reassigned to training fields back home. To most commanders, it was an expensive mistake. 12 aircraft, millions of dollars, and a concept that collapsed the moment bombs left the racks. But engineers didn't see a failure. They saw data. At Wright Field, combat reports were spread across tables stained with coffee and oil. Patterns emerged fast. Every YB-40 engagement told the same story. When German fighters attacked from the front, something changed. Attacks broke off. Head-on passes failed. Pilots who once charged straight through bomber formations suddenly turned away early. The reason sat in the nose. The chin turret, 2.50 caliber guns with a clear forward field of fire. No blind spot, no convergence guesswork. One gunner tracking one target straight ahead. German pilots who had mastered 12 o'clock attacks now faced concentrated fire they couldn't dodge. That turret worked perfectly. So the Army Air Forces did what war forces you to do. They cut away the failure and kept the truth. The extra guns went. The armor went. The weight went. But the chin turret stayed. By September 1943, it entered full production. By December, it defined the new B-17G. Factories retooled. Lines accelerated. Thousands of flying fortresses rolled out, carrying a solution born from a dead program. Loss rates told the rest of the story. Frontal attack kills dropped. Crews noticed immediately. Bombardiers who once braced for impact now had a weapon that answered back. The flying destroyer never protected a formation, but its best idea protected thousands of men who would never know its name. The YB-40 failed, fast failed publicly, and failed hard. And because it did, tens of thousands of airmen lived long enough to come home. Sometimes the most important victories come from learning exactly how not to fight the war. 11. While American engineers argued over weight and performance, the Luftwaffe reached its own conclusion fast. German intelligence officers didn't need theories. They had combat footage. Gun camera film showed the YB-40, clearly extra turrets, no bomb bay doors, a heavier silhouette that lagged behind once the formation turned for home. It stood out, and in aerial combat, standing out meant dying first. Fighter pilots compared notes after missions. The flying destroyer looked terrifying on approach, but it couldn't chase, couldn't climb, couldn't run. Once it slowed, it behaved like every other straggler, only bigger and more predictable. The extra guns didn't scare them away. They changed tactics instead. Why charge a wall of fire head-on when patience worked better? German pilots circled outside gun range. They waited for fuel to burn down engines to overheat altitude to bleed away. Then they attacked from multiple directions, forcing the heavy gunship to split its fire and expose its weaknesses. The YB-40 didn't break formations, it became the formation's weakest link. Luftwaffe fighter commanders summarized it brutally. The YB-40 kills were insignificant. The aircraft cost too much, flew too slow, and offered no strategic threat. In fact, attacking it was preferable. It drew fire. It isolated itself. It was easier to finish than a standard bomber still protected by speed and altitude. The verdict from the other side of the war was clear. The flying destroyer was not a deterrent, it was an invitation. By the time American command reached the same realization, the outcome was already written in the sky. The YB-40 had been judged not just by engineers or pilots, but by the enemy it was built to stop. And the enemy had no reason to fear it. What mattered now wasn't pride or persistence. It was what could still be salvaged from the wreckage of a bad idea before more crews paid the price for proving it again. 12. By late summer 1943, there was nothing left to debate. Mission after mission had written the same verdict in fuel logs and damage reports. Every YB-40 fell behind. Everyone needed help. The aircraft designed to protect bomber formations had become the one aircraft that could not survive without protection itself. In August, General Karl Spaatz signed the order. The YB-40 program was over. 12 aircraft, 3 months of combat testing, 48 sorties flown into the most dangerous airspace on Earth, 5 confirmed German fighters destroyed, 1 YB-40 lost, millions of dollars spent, and an idea officially declared dead. The surviving gunships were quietly pulled from combat. No announcements, no ceremony. Some were stripped of their extra guns and converted back into standard bombers. Others were shipped home to the United States and reassigned as gunnery trainers, their combat scars hidden behind training schedules and paperwork. The flying destroyer vanished almost overnight. No museums requested one. No preservation orders were issued. By November, the last YB-40S had crossed the Atlantic westbound. Most were cannibalized for parts. A few were scrapped outright. One would briefly appear in the background of a post-war Hollywood film, an unrecognized relic of a failed experiment. On paper, the program was a loss. $5.6 million spent on aircraft that solved nothing and created new problems. To commanders under pressure to reduce losses, it was a mistake best forgotten. But the war didn't forget, because buried in the reports that ended the YB-40 were details that refused to die. Notes about frontal attacks breaking off. Diagrams of overlapping fire that worked exactly once. Observations that hinted something important had been learned the hard way. The program was dead. Its consequences were just beginning to fly. And in the factories and design offices back in America, engineers were already turning failure into something the enemy would soon learn to fear. 13. When the YB-40 was grounded, its airframe stopped flying, but its lessons didn't. At Wright Field and Boeing design offices, engineers dissected the combat reports line by line. They weren't asking why the flying destroyer failed. They already knew that. The real question was harder: what worked anyway? The first answer was obvious. Every time German fighters attacked from 12 o'clock high, the result changed. Head-on passes broke early. Pilots who once charged straight through bomber formations suddenly turned away. The chin turret had erased a blind spot that had been killing crews for months. 2 forward-firing .50 caliber guns, clean sight picture, no guessing. Simple, lethal, unavoidable. The second lesson came from the waist gunners. On standard B-17s, both waist gunners stood directly opposite each other, fighting for space in the worst moments. Combat footage showed men colliding, blocking traverse, losing precious seconds during attacks from the beam. The YB-40 fixed it by accident. The right waist gun was moved forward, staggered. Each gunner had room to move, to track, to reload without interference. Engagement times increased. Jam rates dropped. Survivability improved. The third improvement came from the tail. Tail gunners reported the same problem again and again: limited visibility, small windows, blind zones below and behind. Sergeant Raymond Cack's after-action notes made it clear you couldn't fight what you couldn't see. Engineers responded with a redesign: larger windows, better armor, improved gun mounts. The Cheyenne tail gave gunners the vision they'd been missing when fighters came up from 6 o'clock low. 3 ideas survived a dead aircraft. No extra weight, no flying gunship fantasies, just practical solutions forged under fire. The YB-40 hadn't failed completely. It had separated illusion from reality, and those 3 hard-earned answers were about to change every flying fortress that followed, whether the enemy liked it or not. 14. Those 3 changes didn't stay on drafting tables for long. By late 1943, production lines across America were already transforming. The chin turret moved from experiment to standard equipment. Staggered waist positions were locked into new fuselages. The Cheyenne tail reshaped the bomber's silhouette. Out of the YB-40's failure emerged a new aircraft, the B-17G. And this time, the numbers told a different story. When the first G models reached England, crews noticed it immediately: frontal attacks. The deadliest threat they knew no longer felt inevitable. German fighters that once charged straight in at 12 o'clock high now hesitated. Many broke off early. Others pressed through and paid for it. Combat reports stacked up. Loss rates from head-on attacks collapsed. Entire groups tracked the change with disbelief. What had once been a killing corridor became contested airspace. Bombardiers weren't just bracing anymore, they were fighting back. Factories surged to meet demand. Boeing, Douglas, Vega, 3 companies building the same solution at a relentless pace. Dozens of aircraft per month became hundreds. By mid-1944, thousands of B-17Gs filled the skies over Europe, each one carrying ideas born from a program that lasted only 3 months. The irony was impossible to miss. The YB-40 had failed because it tried to be everything at once. The B-17G succeeded because it learned restraint. It kept what worked. It discarded what didn't. Speed and altitude remained its armor. Firepower filled the gaps that had been killing crews. By the time Allied bombers pushed deep into Germany with full fighter escort, the Flying Fortress was no longer the same aircraft that had bled so heavily in 1943. It was tougher, smarter, deadlier where it mattered. The flying destroyer never won the war, but the lessons written in its bullet holes helped reshape the bomber that would. 15. By the time the war ended, no YB-40 remained to tell its own story. They had vanished quietly, cut apart, reassigned, forgotten. No museum preserved them. No victory parade ever mentioned their name. History moved on, as it always does, toward machines that worked. But in the skies over Europe, the YB-40 never truly disappeared.